Halo, masuk gak suaraku? Kamu. Ini jangan ngomong apa? Cek, 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 cek. Masuk. Ini aku mulai ya. From the camp, from the refugee camp in Gaza, he grew become the leader of Hamas. Ismail Haniyeh, oh, oh, sih Google aja. Bahasa Inggris kayak gitu. Baca aja. Oh, nervous, nervous, nervous. Iya, udah. The killers of journalists continue their heinous crimes by assassinating Al Jazeera cameraman and three other journalists. The blood of our martyred journalists in Gaza has not yet dried before the Israeli occupation forces committed another crime against Al Jazeera cameraman Mohammed Salama, together with three other photojournalists. Today, occupation forces killed our colleague, Mohammed Salama, Hassam Al-Masri, a photojournalist working for Reuters. This atrocity occurred during an attack on the Nasser medical complex in Khan Yunis, resulting in the deaths of over 20 civilians, including patients and members of the press, without distinction between those under medical care and those holding cameras to document the crimes. Amen.
kelas online, podcast tentang Palestina, event olahraga, sampai event skala nasional dan internasional. Selain itu, kita juga berisik. Like literally berisik. Dengan kampanye kreatif baik berisik, kita sadarkan pemuda seluruh Indonesia untuk terus bergerak mendukung kemerdekaan Palestina, baik secara online maupun kegiatan-kegiatan offline. Saat ini, ribuan pemuda dari berbagai daerah di Indonesia telah tergabung ke dalam komunitas baik berisik dan terus bergerak secara masif. Dengan lantang mereka berkata, saat Palestina terusik, jangan hanya berbisik, kita harus berisik. Dari program kampanye ini, SMART satu tujuan mendapatkan penghargaan Best Program pada konferensi Global Women's Coalition for Al-Quds and Palestine tahun 2022 di Turki. Smart Camp, salah satu program paling seru karena just try it yourself. Saking pentingnya berjejaring, kita adakan juga media gathering agar
Alhamdulillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulilladzi alafa baina qulubina fa asbahna bi ni'matihi ikhwana. Assalatu wassalamu ala asrafil anbiya wal mursalin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in amma ba'du. Alhamdulillah. Selamat malam teman-teman semua. Oke, energinya masih full ya insya Allah ya. Atau setengah, seperempat ada. Insya Allah udah makan juga, udah semangat lagi teman-teman semua. Malam ini kita akan mendengarkan materi yang luar biasa dari Prof. Sami Arian. Ya, insya Allah malam ini akan dimoderatori oleh Teh Nabila. Aku mau sapa Teh Nabila terlebih dahulu. Assalamualaikum Teh Nabila. Cek sound.
Assalamualaikum.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi
Dengar nggak?
wabarakatuh.
Halo. Assalamualaikum.
Oke, Teh Nabila gimana kabarnya Teh?
Alhamdulillah Teh Sarah tetap seperti biasa,
Alhamdulillah.
cantik dan luar biasa.
Teh Nabila tuh sekarang lagi ada di Medan.
Aku
Ya.
di Medan.
Iya, Masya Allah. Nah, Teh Nabila kangen sama Smart Camp.
Kangen banget. Allahu Akbar. I miss you guys all so much. Hi
Masya
everyone.
Allah. Hai. Oke, Teh Nabila, aku persilahkan ke Teh Nabila untuk memoderatori agenda bersama Prof. Sami. Kepada Teh Nabila kami persilahkan.
Oke. Suaraku terdengar jelas ya?
Ya Allah.
Mohon maaf banget kalau tidak terdengar jelas karena tidak menggunakan mikrofon ataupun earphone, jadi ini pakai speaker teman-teman. Tapi semoga bisa sampai ya. Oke, bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good evening, everyone. It's a really huge disappointment for me for not being there with you. I miss you guys all so much, my dear friends. But Alhamdulillah, we all are here. It is a blessing that we can be together this evening, united by a shared concern, a shared conscience, which a blessing, a shared responsibility also to stand up for truth and justice. Our presence here, hopefully, it reflects not only intellectual curiosity, but also moral commitment for us to always stand up for Palestine. So tonight, we are about to listen, to learn a lecture that will hopefully will open our eyes wider to one of the most urgent struggles of our time, which is the Palestinian struggle, and more specifically, the battle of narrative that shape how the world perceives this struggle. We are truly honored tonight to welcome a distinguished scholar, a thinker, an activist whose contribution to civil liberties, human rights, and the Palestinian cause are recognized worldwide. He is I guess it's the second time. I guess it's the second time for him to be here with us for Smart Camp. Am I right? I guess right. He is the director of the Center for Islam and Global Affairs at Istanbul Sabahattin Zem University. And his voice has been a source of clarity and inspiration for our movements across the globe. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Professor Dr. Sami Arian. Professor, good evening, Professor.
Good evening, and thank you so much.
Assalamualaikum, Professor.
Alaikum
Please,
salam.
Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your kind introduction, and thank you everyone for being here tonight. This is a address that I'm looking forward to give and also to hear your comments and questions. So let me delve right onto it. I do have a PowerPoint presentation to accompany my presentation. Just give me a moment here. Very well. What we will try to do tonight, per the request of the organizers, is to identify the dominant Zionist narratives in a global discourse. What have they been using in order to get their project and enterprise being embraced not only by world Jewry, but also by world powers? Also, I would like to present briefly my theory of the Zionist 12 imperatives, what makes Zionism endure, what makes it, what is staying power, its strength, and sources of expansion and existence. Also, we'll try to unveil the strategies or the influence enabling those narratives to endure, and define Zionist lobbying briefly and its political goals, particularly in capitals that make a difference. These are the capitals that have been controlling the world affairs or international relations, and also analyze the power, media, and public opinion loop, and finally apply a counter framework rooted in my theory, which I've tried to do it while I'm presenting my theory. So what are the dominant Zionist narratives? I will try to present 15 of them and try to debunk them all as we go over them one by one. The first one was when Zionism started, it wanted to get it embraced or adopted by world powers as well as by Jews who have been scattered for centuries around the world. And it was this myth of a land without people, that Palestine was empty, that Palestine did not have anyone in it. It was just a desert waiting for Zionists to come and bloom it. And of course, this is a myth because Palestinians existed in the land for not centuries, but for millenniums. The history and the archaeology of this fact cannot be debunked, cannot be overlooked. What we're talking about here is towards the emergence of political Zionism towards the end of the 19th century, Palestine had existed by that time for 4 centuries under the Ottomans, and before that under many other rulers, whether these were within the context of the Islamic empires or the Islamic Ummah at the time, or even before that. Everybody understands also when the Crusaders came to this region, to the Middle East, around the 11th and 12th centuries, Palestine was full of its people. Everybody understands also when Muslims went to Palestine, the people of Palestine embraced the religion of Islam. It's also where the emergence of Christianity took place. And that's why you find many Christians as well as Muslims in Palestine. Jews did exist in Palestine, but they were much smaller in numbers than the Zionists were claiming. So Palestine has always existed with its inhabitants from time immemorial, with the dominant forces being the people who actually lived there, who embraced different religions at different times, whether it was Christianity or whether it was Islam. Judaism, by the way, was never the dominant at any juncture in history. Yes, they claim to have had some states in which it existed in Palestine for a few decades, but even that has been disputed now with the new archaeology and the new with new historians. The other, and I'm trying to go quickly because my time is limited, and we have plenty of things to cover, that the Jews were a people without a land. Again, this is a lie, because Jews existed throughout history in terms of beliefs. This Judaism is not an ethnicity where we say that they had to belong to a particular land. Like any other religion, any person could be a Jew, could be a Christian, could be a Muslim, could be a Hindu, Buddhist, whatever. And the Jews were scattered around the world. They existed in dozens and dozens of countries for different reasons. Yes, they faced persecution and racism and discrimination, particularly in Christian countries. That was not the case when Jews lived under Islam and Islamic laws, because Islam simply recognizes Judaism as one of the greatest religions, and that it has its own status within Islamic society. Jews consider the Islamic time that they lived under, particularly in Andalusia and throughout, as their golden age. They call that the golden age of Jews, because they contrast that with what they had to endure under Christian rulers and emperors. So it is not true that Jews were a people without a land, because they do exist in many parts of the world. Yes, they had to endure, like Muslims did during the Middle Ages, some discrimination from European societies, such as in Spain, Christian Spain and Portugal. But then they had to face other discrimination, particularly in Eastern Europe. But after the Renaissance, after the separation of church and state, they were emancipated. But Zionism felt that this discrimination was, in terms of Europe, was endemic, that it cannot be expunged, and therefore their solution was towards the end of the 19th century, was that they must have their own nation state, like other nation states that were coming throughout the world. That was their solution to the racism of Europe, and they chose eventually Palestine, even though Palestinians and Muslims and Christians of the East have absolutely nothing to do with their suffering in Europe, particularly during the pogroms and later on the Holocaust. The third myth that the Zionists tried to propagate is that Palestinians sold their lands. That's another myth that has no basis in reality whatsoever. Let's remind ourselves, let's remember that at the end of the First World War in 1918, Britain occupied Palestine. The number of Jews in Palestine at the time did not exceed possibly 30,000 or so, less than 5% of the population. And these were actually after the acceleration of some Jews who settled in Palestine toward the end of the 19th century, where Palestinians received them as refugees, people fleeing persecution, particularly in Eastern Europe. But once the British took over, they allowed unlimited immigration, which is illegal in international law. When you occupy a country, you bring other people to occupy it or to invade it or to settle in it, while the indigenous people are prevented from having the right to self-determination and making their own laws. Nevertheless, Britain allowed unrestrained immigration, and then it started a policy of forcing some Palestinians to give up their land, because during the Ottomans, many Palestinians were farming their land and they will pay the state taxes towards the end of the year. In some instances, the British did not collect taxes for many years, and then they will go after 5 or 10 years asking the Palestinians to pay a heavy tax that went back 5 or 10 years, which the Palestinian farmers could not pay. Then they will turn to Zionist organizations, Jewish organizations, in which they will pay the tax bill and then take over the land. And then you have other families who basically were not even Palestinian families, such as the Sursuk and the Salam families. These were Lebanese families. They were tax collectors for the Ottomans. And the structure of the Palestine during the Ottomans was different from what it was during the British, because the north of Palestine actually belonged to the province of Beirut, because there were no borders. These borders were drawn by the imperialists, by Sykes-Picot, the British and the French, towards the end of the First World War. But the north of Palestine belonged to the province of Beirut. The tax collectors were Lebanese. They sold some land. One sold 200,000, the family of Al-Sursuk and Al-Salam, 400,000 acres. But even with this, and the grants that the British gave, and the few people who sold from Palestine, and the expropriation of land, taking it illegally and giving it to the Jewish agency, all this did not amount on the eve of 1948 to more than 6.5% of the total land of Palestine. This is documented by the United Nations, because in 1947 and 48, the United Nations sent several commissions to see how much land was owned by Jewish owners or the Jewish agency, and the total Jewish land at the time was less than 6.5% of the total Palestinian land. So this myth that Palestinians sold their land and therefore they gave up is just a myth. It never happened. Palestinians were on this land throughout the millennium. They were farming it, they were using it, and most of the land was taken by force through the brutality and violence of the Jewish gangs and Jewish militias. The fourth dominant Zionist narrative is that Zionism is Judaism. This is false from the start, because Zionism is a political movement. Zionism is not a religion. It's a political movement that believes that Jews have the inherent right of establishing an independent sovereign state in Palestine at the expense of the Palestinians, using whatever means available to them. Zionism also, once it is inspected, is a supremacist, racist movement that aims to expel the Palestinians, to uproot the Palestinians from their land and replace them with Jews anywhere in the world. Any Jew throughout the world could come to the Zionist state and claim citizenship upon arrival, but the Palestinians who are born there and their ancestors existed for thousands of years are denied political and civil rights as people indigenous to the land. And then Zionism, by claiming that Jews have this inherent right, is trying to equate a Jewish person or the Jewish faith with Zionism. And therefore, any critique of Zionism becomes an attack on the Jewish religion. This is farther from the truth, as we know today that Zionism is a political movement. It has its own aims, its own objectives of trying to become the hegemon in the region. It's trying to overtake the whole Middle East in terms of political power and influence, and try to take as much of the Palestinian land and even beyond as possible. That's a political movement. Judaism is a religion, and therefore trying to equate Judaism with Zionism, and therefore any critique of Zionism becomes anti-Semitic, is a false narrative that should never be given even the light of day or any hearing. The fifth narrative that Zionism is trying to say is that Zionism is not colonialism. And as we know, that the Zionist movement came to Palestine under false pretenses. They came in order to take the land, not to live among natives, They used all means, including illegal immigration, by arming themselves, by bringing plans in order to depopulate, expel, and dominate the discourse in Palestine. This happened during the British Mandate from 1918 until about 1948. For about 3 decades, Zionists came with the single aim, that is how to take over the land and how to expel the Palestinians. This is now well known. We can read all the biographies of those who were the founders of the Zionist state, as well as the archive that has been also open to many historians such as Ilan Pape, in which we find out that Zionism was nothing more than a settler colonial movement that is aiming to bring as many Jews from the diaspora, from outside Palestine, into Palestine, and to expel as many Palestinians as possible to take over, which is the classical definition of a settler colonial power. That's exactly what it is. These are not people who actually belong to the land. In fact, if we go and investigate the early arrivals of Jews, these Jews, their ancestors never lived in Palestine. They were converts actually to Judaism from the Khazarian, from the Caspian Sea, while those even who were at one point living in Palestine, if their claim is true, did not live in those areas. These are the difference between Sephardi and Ashkenazi Jews. Nevertheless, Palestine was considered as a spiritual homeland for many Jews because they associate the Bible and the Torah, but that does not give them the right to take over someone's land, someone's property, the ones that they have been living in for centuries and even for millenniums. Actually, religious Jews do not think that they can go back to Palestine on their own. That this is, if this is going to be given, it has to be through transcendence intervention, through God's intervention, not through human efforts. Unlike Zionists, who really didn't care much about Judaic laws or Judaic teachings, all what they wanted to do is to take over the land and try to empower themselves so that they can be a nation state despite the suffering of the indigenous people. The sixth narrative that is used is that the Holocaust grants moral exception and immunity. Of course, this is totally this is totally unacceptable, because what they are saying is that because Jews were exterminated or were targeted by European power, which was Nazi Germany, that entitles them to take someone else's land who has absolutely nothing to do with their suffering and with their persecution by the Nazis. How is if that's valid at any argument, then anybody can claim anything in the world. If the Americans persecute Vietnamese, then the Vietnamese can go and say, we're going to take over Japan's property because we were persecuted by the Americans. No one would accept such logic. There is no actual logic to this. It is an attempt by the Zionists to exploit the fact that Jews were exterminated or were targeted by Nazis, and therefore apply the fact that this happened under European powers, and therefore they need to extort. They were extorting actually Europeans, and they need to exploit this situation in order to get the help and the aid and the support of European and American powers, since the white man in Europe persecuted its Jews, and since the European countries refused to help the Jews during this sad time in history, and therefore they need to atone to these sins by allowing the Zionists to take over someone else's land, such as the Palestinians. This narrative is totally unacceptable and should not be accepted by any rational or sane person. We've seen also many Jews, such as Norman Finkelstein, when he wrote the book, The Holocaust Industry, totally rejects this, because this is actually going to be a stain on the memory of those who were targeted in the Holocaust. Those Jews cannot be used, their suffering cannot be used in order to uh, justify the suffering of the Palestinians at the hands of the Zionists. The seventh narrative that they use is that there has been international recognition and UN partition, and that settled the borders and legitimacy. And of course, if we go and examine what happened then, you will find that this was totally a an attempt by international powers, in this case, the United States and others, in trying to give legitimacy to the Zionist project, to the Zionist enterprise. If you look and investigate the vote of what happened in the United Nations, first of all, Palestine belonged to the Palestinians, and under international law, it is the self-determination of its inhabitants that decides its future. Cannot bring someone else's to take someone's land by others to vote on it. This is totally unacceptable, even international law. But when you go and examine, you will find the amount of pressure that the United States applied so that on different countries, such as the Philippines and others, that's why the vote was delayed 3 times in order to bring the necessary numbers in order to justify the existence or the emergence of the Zionist state. But even with that, it was voted for 55% of Palestine. When the war broke out in 1948, the Zionists were prepared. They had over 60,000 people under arms. They were prepared to take as much land as possible and to expel as many Palestinians as possible. They ended up with 78%. And then in 1967, they went and took the whole of Palestine. And today they refuse to allow any kind of an emergence of a Palestinian state. So this whole thing, this whole exercise of the past 77 years shows one thing and one thing only, that Zionists have been very consistent, that they want all of Palestine and beyond. They have no interest whatsoever in sharing any part of the land. And therefore, because their initial vote was predicated on having an Arab state on 45% and a Jewish state on 55%, even that was not, was not accepted by them. They always were eyeing to get hold of Palestine. So that part also, that narrative is false. The second, the eighth one is that the Palestinians left voluntarily in 1948 on Arab orders. This is far from the truth. Now we know better, again, with the new historians that have uncovered and exposed all the archives that shows what actually happened. There was an Israeli plan. This Israeli plan was actually implemented to the fullest, including what is called Plan Dalet. Plan Dalet is Plan D. Dalet is D in Hebrew, in which the Jewish militias, the Haganah and the Orgon and the Stern and so on and so forth, all of them were, and then which became later on the Israeli Defense Forces, all of them were intent on driving out the Palestinians. We know the massacres that took place in different cities. We know the ethnic cleansing that was taking place in different cities. We know that this happened even before the state was established on the eve of the British departure on May 15th, 1948. We know, for example, that several massacres, like in Deir Yassin and others, were taking place so that they will frighten the Palestinians who were prevented from having any arms to defend themselves. My family, from both sides, from my father and mother, were subjected to these kind of terrorist actions by the Jewish militias in order to drive them out, in order to expel them, in order to make sure that they do not stay in the land. So no one left voluntarily. Actually, many Palestinians left at the site or at the point of the gun. And we know city after city and a village after village where this was taking place. And later on, once that happened, when there was a truce in 1949 and beyond, 532 villages, Palestinian villages and cities and small mid-towns, and were wiped out of the earth in order to make room for other Jewish settlements and Jewish cities. Palestinians did not leave voluntarily, and even if they did, they still have the right to go back. There are international resolutions. There is a UN Security Council resolution 194 in which it says that every Palestinian and their uh, uh, every Palestinian and their children and offspring have the right to go back to their land. They are not, by the fact that they left, they are not deprived from the right to go back. The right of return is enshrined in international law. The ninth narrative, which is also, all these are false narratives by the Zionists and their supporters, is that Israel had wars of no choice, that it had to defeat 7 armies. Now we know better. We know that Israel was preparing for this opportunity to take over, and it's not true. Yes, it was 7 armies, but one army was 300 people or 700 people like Saudi Arabia and Lebanon, or maybe a couple of thousand people like Iraq that never really got to make much combat. We know, for example, that the one who was commanding the Jordanian army was a British General Globe. And we know that on the Egyptian side, there were only less than 12,000 soldiers with arms that was these arms were not working, that they were given to them while they were corrupted and bad arms, and that the British were occupying Egypt at the time, and there were many attempts by the Egyptian regime as well as foreign powers to make sure that the Egyptian army does not have what it takes, not only to defend Palestine, but even to defend their own land. So this myth that Israel by itself, that this David was able to defeat Goliath, is just a myth. There were 60,000 soldiers under arm belonging to the Zionists, and there were less than 30,000 from the Arab side. And even with that, they could not take Jerusalem, for example, even though they tried very hard. And we know also that there were deals with the king of Jordan at the time, the emir of what's called Transjordan, Abdullah, who is the great grandfather of the current king, that there were a deal with him and the Zionists in order to leave certain areas for them so that they can recognize or give him some land on the West Bank. We also know that there have been other deals with different powers in the region as well as international powers to make room for Zionist incursion and Zionist occupation. On the issue of that after 1967, there was this issue that the territories in the 1967 are disputed territories. They're not occupied. Somehow, even though the UN Resolution 242 does not permit the occupation of Palestinian, of any land for that matter, by force, and that any attempt to occupy land by force will not be recognized in international law and will not be given any kind of legitimacy. Now we hear for decades that these are disputed territories because somehow the Zionists would claim that some prophet was here or some ancient Israeli king was there, and therefore these are disputed. And of course, this is nonsense. There is nothing in international law that would recognize such a claim. That all these claims are bogus. And when you look at even the notion that there could be a two-state solution, which is the idea that predicated all kinds of peace attempts by many powers in the world, it was predicated on the fact that 242, the UN resolution that came in November 1967, would exchange recognition to the Zionist state in exchange for the withdrawal from the territories they occupied in 1967, which included the Sinai, the Golan Heights, and the West Bank and Gaza. But we see today, even after over half a century, we are looking at the situation where the Israelis were trying to reoccupy Gaza. They are entrenched in the West Bank. They're trying to claim that it is nothing even, it's not even called West Bank, it is Judea and Samaria, that they have religious claims on these areas, that the Palestinians cannot be given any kind of civil or political rights, that what they want to see is the expulsion of the Palestinians from Gaza, from the West Bank, and to have at least 80% of the of the people in mandated Palestine from the river to the sea, at least 80% are Jewish. So all kinds of things they are claiming. They claim that they left Gaza in 2005 and that the Palestinians were unable to rule themselves, which is again another bogus lie and fabrication, because Israel was in charge of the borders all along. They have laid a siege of 16 years before the Tufan al-Aqsa in October 2023 started. The idea is that they want to control every facet of Palestinian life. Palestinians were unable to travel, unable to leave, unable to come back, unable to bring anything to that, unable to control their economy, unable to even fish in their own territorial waters without Israeli intervention, unable to export anything, import anything, total domination and total control over their lives in every aspect of it. Despite the Palestinians trying to bring in the Palestinian Authority to take over, they refused. Trying to have a truce 7, 10, 15 years, they refused. And trying even to have any kind of a deal through Arab governments such as Egypt, and the Zionists always refused all kinds of things, but they wanted to dominate and control all along. And of course, that is the story of the Palestinians in the West Bank between 1948 and 1966, 18 years. The Palestinians that were left because they were not expelled at the time, about 120,000. Today, they number almost 1.3 million or more. These people were under martial law for 18 years. They could not even leave their own homes without permission. Total control of the Palestinians of 1948. Now, in the West Bank, you find that there are over 1,000 checkpoints. A Palestinian who lives in Birzeit trying to go to their own job, or someone in Ramallah trying to go to their own university in Birzeit, it will take them hours sometimes to get there, even though they can walk within 15 minutes because of the number of checkpoints that are implanted in the West Bank in order to make life unlivable, to make it as hard as possible in order to induce their departure and their expulsion. The other myth is that this is all about security, that this is the most moral army, that the Palestinians use human shields. And of course, this is debunked, particularly after the massacres and the genocide. We saw how Israel is the Israeli army is the most immoral in the history of armies, how they have zero regards to any life, how they target children. We have testimony after testimony from doctors, from the medical staff, of how they, even these are foreigners, these are not Palestinians, how they, when they examined children, they found that there is a deliberate attempt to shoot at their upper body, at their heads, and to make sure that they will be losing limbs and then they will be suffering all along. We saw how they went after families, entire families, journalists, medical staff, civil servants, women, children. This is the most immoral, and then they celebrate it. They don't even hide it. You can find in social media hundreds, maybe thousands of videos in which they celebrate killing and targeting Palestinians. Their officials, their ministers, their political leaders call for the extermination of the Palestinians, even of children and women. This is a hateful ideology that they have been indoctrinated now for decades, for over 100 years, and that's what they're trying to do now for Palestinians in Gaza as the charge for a human shield. Again, this has been debunked as all the claims that this hospital belongs to Hamas or belongs to the resistance, and this building and this and that. When people went and examined, they found there is zero evidence that any of these buildings or any of these places were used by the resistance, let alone to act as a human shield. There is no reason for them to do that, and everybody knows that they were using AI and other tools. If they think, and this is just a good guess on their part, that there is a Hamas fighter or an Islamic Jihad fighter or resistance fighter in one place, they have no problem bombing this place if it has 100 people in it in order to kill one person. That's an act of someone who is not moral. That's act of someone that is truly evil. The other thing is that armed resistance is terrorism, and this is, of course, is another attempt by the media and Zionist-supported media to propagate, because armed resistance actually is enshrined in international law. There are many resolutions that actually legitimize the armed resistance fact, particularly in Palestine. In 1964, for example, there is an international resolution in the United Nations in which it recognizes the right of all occupied people to use all means in order to achieve their freedom and self-determination, including armed resistance. And in that resolution, even they name the Palestinians' right for armed resistance. And this is way even before the 1967 occupation. In other words, the Palestinians had the right to use armed resistance to free themselves in the 1948 areas. If this is a 1964 resolution that calls on Palestinians have the right to get back to their land and right of return, this is talking about the 1948, not even the 1967, let alone the 1967 territories. And this whole thing is just another attempt by the Zionist supported media and institutions in order to delegitimize the struggle of the Palestinian people. Palestinian people have the right to use all means in order to free themselves from the yoke, from the violence, from the brutality of the Zionist occupation, Zionist invasion, colonialism, using all and whatever means available to them, including if they opt to armed resistance. But of course, it has to be within the international humanitarian law as much as they can, being dominated by the Zionist armies and the Zionist military. The 13th, and I try to keep them 15 so I don't go too much beyond my time, is that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. That's also another false narrative that we hear about it a lot within the particularly Western circles and Western media narratives. And this is, of course, false, because what they are trying to say is that Israel is the only Jewish democracy in the Middle East. So if we look at the number of people between the river and the sea, we're having almost 15 million people. About half of them or so are Palestinians who are unable to exercise any kind of decision making over their own lives. They are totally dominated by one. And the fact that the Israelis have the right to decide on the fate of the Palestinians is not a democracy. This is domination. This should not be accepted in any way, shape, or form. If some people would say that during the time when there was slavery was recognized in the United States, where blacks had zero political and civil rights, and that they said that this was a democracy where millions of people were disenfranchised, or if we take the example of South Africa, no one is going to describe this situation as democracy, except it's democracy within the dominant class or the dominant ethnicity. And in this case, this should not be accepted on its face, because certainly the Palestinians do not have equal rights, and they cannot decide on anything related to Jews, let alone they cannot decide on anything related to themselves, let alone what may affect the Jewish communities within the Palestinian territories, and therefore this should not be accepted. The 14th rather, is that Oslo was a genuine path to peace. Now, if we go and examine this, and this is very important because this talks about, maybe I can put both, two-state solution. Let's remember that Oslo was a process that was supposed to lead to one that the Palestinian victims, in the voice of their official representative, the PLO at the time, was going to recognize Israel on 78% of historical Palestine in exchange for 22%. This was the idea, the general idea is that Palestinians have already done, again, not all Palestinians have voted for this, but at least the official representative at the time, the PLO, opted to recognize Israel on 78%. thinking that somehow there will be a Palestinian state, so-called two-state solution. But if you look at what happened since, in 1993, when Oslo was signed in the lawn of the White House, there were about 125,000 settlers. Today, there are over 800,000 settlers in the West Bank. That's not a sign of anyone who is willing to compromise whatsoever. The Palestinians, the Palestinian leadership has made a colossal mistake by providing Israel with the cover of legitimacy by recognizing it on 78% in exchange for only that the PLO would be the negotiating partner. And for 3 decades, over 3 decades, there was absolutely no result, no fruits of these kind of negotiations. In fact, we saw vividly how the Israelis were trying to not only not negotiate in good faith, but they were trying to colonize and expand their situation in the West Bank and try to make it very difficult for the Palestinians to stay on their land and try to force them to leave. Oslo was not a genuine path to peace. It was an attempt by the Israelis to divide the Palestinians and to make room for themselves, to lull the world in thinking that there is a genuine peace process while there was not. In the meantime, they were trying to absorb as much of the land as possible and to frustrate as many of the Palestinians as possible and try not to have the Palestinians believe that their struggle could actually lead to their freedom, but that they have zero ability to get anything out of the Israelis, and therefore they can give up and leave. That was the whole issue of Oslo. And let's remember, Oslo came as a response to the Palestinian Intifada inside the occupied territories that stayed for years trying to reject the occupation and try to find other means by which Palestinians can free themselves. So that's why the Palestinians opted for this, particularly after the first Gulf War, when Saddam occupied Kuwait, and Arafat, who was leading the Palestinians at the time, made the mistake of supporting Saddam, and then he was totally isolated from all capitals. Then he found himself back in when he gave this compromise, when he gave this concession by, first of all, renouncing the right of Palestinians to defend themselves and to use whatever means available to them, and secondly, by recognizing Israel on 78% of Palestine, and this is where we are today. Now, finally, about the two-state solution, there is no two-state solution. This is a ruse. This is a lie that many political leaders around the world continue to propagate, continue to peddle, because they want to say that, okay, well, there is something there, otherwise they would have to confront the central question: what are we going to do with the Israeli plan to expropriate, to take over the whole land? They don't want to deal with this situation, so they give this ruse, this lie, this fabricated statement that somehow there is still a viable two-state solution. There is no two-state solution. As I said earlier, the Israelis have killed this long time ago. Even the Secretary of State of Obama in 2016, in December 2016, John Kerry said that there is no two-state solution, that the Israelis have killed it, and they are very proud to say that we have killed it. There is no viable state when you see that hundreds of thousands of settlers are all over Palestine, and that these will not be expunged, these will not be uprooted from the West Bank. If they had problem uprooting 8,000 in Gaza, how are they going to uproot 800,000? And with the balance of power as it is today, this is just a really a silly lie that they try to lull the populations, particularly in the Muslim world, those governments who still talk about a two-state solution, and they know fairly well that this is not the case, are not only deceiving themselves, but also deceiving their people. There is no two-state solution, even though on paper it might solve some of the problems, but in actuality, in reality, there is no two-state solution. Israel had a choice to make when Oslo came about, that they can choose the land, they can choose the being a Jewish majority, or they can choose apartheid. To choose the being Jewish majority, that would have been the two-state solution. They would have preserved their 80% mark of having 80% of the population as Jewish. They would only have about 20% or less as Arab. That would have been a two-state solution. They rejected that completely. Actually, they opted on a very aggressive settlement policy. The one-state solution means that everybody between the river and the sea have equal vote. That would be the end of the Zionist project of having Jewish majority in Palestine, and therefore all parties in the Zionist state, regardless of ideology, reject this. So there is no one-state solution, and that left that they want the land, that they want to claim that they are a Jewish democracy, that they are democracy, and therefore only Jews, and disenfranchise the Palestinians. That's an apartheid regime, and that's exactly what they ended up with. Now they're trying to find a fourth option, which is to expel the Palestinians to solve this demographic problem so that they can bring back the 80% magic number for Jews to exist in historical Palestine, and that's through ethnic cleansing and genocide. That's what they've been trying to do in Gaza since October 2023. That's what they would like to do in the West Bank in order to claim back. And to do this, they have to commit war crimes and genocide. That's exactly what they have been doing so far. Now, these are the Zionist. So now let me talk very quickly. And please, I don't know if I'm going to be able to finish everything I wanted in the time allotted to me. So if I go over time, you can stop me and I can stop and maybe we can talk later. But I wanted to give you also my 12 Zionist imperatives and counter imperatives. This is my theory, which I developed some time ago, in which I find the solution, the only acceptable solution to these problems is to dismantle the Zionist structures, because these structures are, as I said, are racist, supremacist. They want to uproot the indigenous people, and therefore they cannot stay. They cannot be allowed to stay. And therefore, when I studied the imperatives, the sources of strength of the Zionist state and the Zionist enterprise and the Zionist entity, I found that these are the 12 imperatives. These are like pillars. If we look at the state as a building, this building is sitting on 12 pillars, 12 columns, and that these 12 columns, if they are shaken, if there is a counter imperative by which they can be weakened, these Zionist structures could eventually collapse. That is the theory. And the first one is exclusivism, which means that the Zionists want to exclusively have this land to Jews. And therefore, the counter imperative is to be against exclusivism, not allow or try to empty or not allow Jews to have an exclusive right in Palestine. So any Jew who does not leave their country and go to Israel is again and against Zionism imperatives. Any Jews inside who are fed up with the Zionist narrative and with the Zionist aggression, they leave. That's also a plus on this side, that this should not be exclusively for Jewish only. The second, which is the flip side of that, is exclusion, and that is to exclude as many Palestinians from the land of Palestine as possible. And therefore, our counter imperative is we are against exclusion, for the right of return, for restitution, for reparations, for the ability of Palestinians to go back and not leave their country. This is very important, that we support the presence and existence and return of the Palestinians to the historical land of Palestine. The more we do this, the more the Zionist enterprise would be undermined. The third one is expansion and colonization. So this has to do with the land. They want to expand. They started with first by building few settlements in Palestine towards the beginning of the 20th century. They start to expand. By the eve of their war, they had about 6% of Palestine. After the war, even though the partition gave them 55%, they had 78%. In the next 67, they had even 100%. And today, the more they leave, the more we can contract this, the better it is. They try to have settlements. Now they want to expand into southern Lebanon, southern Syria. Even Netanyahu last week was talking about a greater Israel. He wants to get even Egypt, lands from Egypt and Saudi Arabia, and even as far as Iraq. You know, this fantasy about from the Euphrates to the Nile, which Israeli extremists, Zionist extremists are trying to propagate All that is part of this plan of expansion and colonization. So the more they contract in the land, the better it would be to undermine Zionism. The fourth one is creating facts on the ground. And the counterclaim here, or the counter imperative, is we're not allowing them to do that. They tried to do that in Lebanon during the 80s. They were denied to do that. They tried to do it in the Sinai also in the 70s. They had to withdraw. So the more they create facts on the ground, that like what they're trying to do today with building hundreds of settlements and bringing hundreds of thousands of settlers in, that should not be allowed for them. But that's their way of trying to claim more land. The fifth one is create a garrison state, a military state, where every adult between the age of 18 to 50 for males and 18 to 40 for females become an automatic reservist or automatic military person that can be sent and fight and kill Palestinians and Arabs and Muslims and others. And this is the type of state Israel is. It has the largest military budget in terms of GDP in the world. It has built hundreds of bases and trying to acquire whatever it can to do that. Then when we see that the Haradim or the religious students are not do not want to fight, we should encourage that. As we see other people who refuse to actually accept to be reservists or accept to be trained by the Zionist army, we should prevent those people who come from outside Zionists who volunteer in order to come and kill Palestinians. We need to break this cycle of making it a military state bent on controlling and killing Palestinians. The sixth imperative is developing the military doctrine, which is to have an overwhelming force to win against any and all enemies and maintain military technology edge over all rivals. We've seen in Tuwan al-Aqsa, and I have a whole lecture on this, that many of these military doctrines have been debunked. We saw, that, for example, that the doctrine of early warning system, of effective deterrence, strong defense, preemptive strike, quick resolution, escalation dominance, all these different military doctrines have been undermined, and they still having problem trying to even end the war and have what they call absolute or total victory over Hamas in Gaza, or trying actually to subdue Hezbollah in Lebanon or defeat Iran. All these they haven't been able to do, unlike what they were, unlike the successes they were having during the 60s and 70s. Today, many of these military doctrines have been undermined. And number 7 is to maintain monopoly of nuclear weapons. And that means that they should not be allowed to have nuclear monopoly. And therefore, the policies of the world should be to have a nuclear freeze or nuclear free Middle East, or allow other states to have nuclear weapons, because this is should not be allowed that one state will have the monopoly of nuclear weapons in order to use it whenever it chooses, or at least frighten the others from confronting its aggressive behavior because of that. So we should the world should deal with this, and like a country like Pakistan should also give nuclear cover for any one in the Middle East if Israel thinks about using its military power, its nuclear military power against it. The 8th one is to build the most efficient, sophisticated, and ruthless security apparatus and intelligence operations needed to control the populations everywhere in Palestine and beyond. And of course, we have seen this in terms of the assassination policies and others, and therefore we need to be against this by creating, again, a system in which that could actually be curtailed and they could be held accountable in different countries, like they were trying to assassinate different people, different countries. Number 9 is to linking tightly with an international power and benefactor, even if it has to serve as a client state. We saw how it was first with Britain, now with the United States. So there has to be a very strong movement in the United States to break this link with Zionism, because much of the sources of power comes from there. And number 10 is to keep world Jewry, especially in the US and Europe, Zionist and unquestionable support for Israel. That means we cannot look at this as a religious war. This is not a religious war. This is a war of aggressive people against innocent people. And therefore, we need to divide Jews of the world, those who are Zionist and those who are non-Zionist. Those who are non-Zionist Jews are partners against these Zionists who are trying to dominate and control. And therefore, we need to keep as many Jews in the world against being Zionized by the Zionist state, because this is where they think they can bring the new recruits. And therefore, we cannot look at this as a religious war. It is not a religious war. In Islam, we know very well Islam recognizes Judaism as one of the greatest religions, and therefore we cannot accept this notion that Jews are automatically Zionists or we should throw them into the arms of the Zionists. Actually, Jews, if they are true to their religion, they will be totally against Zionism, because Zionism now is undermining their safety and their security and their presence as people with conscience and people who can uphold justice and uphold truth and uphold human rights. Number 11 is to keep the enemy divided and weak and fragment the Middle East and beyond. This has to do with the region, and that's exactly what they've been trying to do. So try to fragment this region to make sure that it cannot be united. It cannot have any kind of a future. You know, even when the Arab Spring came, it was trying to undermine this Arab Spring. Any attempt at unity, it's against it. Any attempt at scientific advancement, it's against it. They could kill their scientists. Any attempt to have even economic prosperity, it goes and makes sure that it can break up the region into many countries. We've seen that they're trying to become a regional hegemon by allying themselves with minorities. They want to create a Druze state, a Maronite state. They want to create a Kurdish state. They want to have this region broken up into 43 different countries, not just 22 in the Arabs and even beyond, because this is how they can rule. There was a plan that came in 1982, which is called the Yunan Plan, somebody who was a strategic thinker for the defense minister at the time, in which they say that plainly they want to divide up and break up the whole region. They were the primary source for South Sudan to split from Sudan. They're trying to keep this whole region not only divided, they're trying to again establish a Druze state so that they can keep control and hegemony. So all these are sources of power, and what people have to do is to look at beyond. Now, when you look at this, you will find that these kind of imperatives, the Palestinians themselves cannot undo them. They cannot fight them. They cannot weaken them, because the Palestinians at the end, you know, they are small people, but they have been valiant and they have been courageous and they have been able to defend and in the struggle against this Zionist incursion. And you will find that Zionism is a threat not only against Palestinians, but against the whole region, the Arab state and the Arab order and the Arab national security, as well as the Islamic. They're willing to lash out against Turkey and Pakistan and Iran and whoever else is going to come to the aid of the Palestinians. And therefore, people have to look at the Zionist threat as a threat against their own national security, and that they have to be engaged as partners, not simply as helpers or aids to the Palestinians. This is part of the global struggle today against Zionism attempt to dictate how the world should be ruled. We saw how they go after any person or any institution that are willing to defend Palestinian rights or to even speak the truth or even stand up against war crimes. They are willing to go against them, which would change the whole world and how the world looks at conflicts and looks at struggles and looks at what is right and what is wrong, what is truth and what is false, what is just and what is unjust. And therefore, this is our global call. This is the struggle that will define our time. Palestine has become a global source of inspiration for those who would like to uphold these values of freedom, of justice, of real, genuine peace, of human rights, of the rule of law. All these things are being undermined today by the Zionist structures and by the Zionist state, and therefore any person who cares about these issues must find them as their own struggle, not as just a simple struggle. Now, very quickly, let me just talk about the strategies and influence enabling Zionist narratives. We find them in the statecrafts, where they will like to have dual legal orders, one for them, one for the others, settlement enterprise, annexation, and so on. The forced posture with short wars, offshore harming, the tech edge, the nuclear opacity and monopoly or security, governance with surveillance, informants, border control, targeted killings. All these are part of the strategies they use. Also, they use patronage and diplomacy, as we saw with the United States, where they get massive aid and therefore they are not answerable to anyone. They really don't care about anybody's opinion except the United States, and they manipulate and control the U.S. scene in many institutions, media, and political elites and business people, and so on and so forth. There is also this meta-politics with the lobby ecosystems and philanthropy into many institutions. Now, even they try to corrupt these institutions, even within the academia, within universities, and how they use also all kinds of things in order to keep the pressure on those who support Palestinian rights or even willing to speak the truth by weaponizing the law and weaponizing politics in order to punish people. We saw also how they try to use regional engineering to fragment opponents, ally with the despots, with the tyrants, with the minorities against the popular forces. These are some of their things. Let me skip Zionist lobbying because I think this is another altogether. So I'm going to skip that so to be within my time. All these are Zionist lobbying and strategies they use. Now, let me go to the last part of my presentation, which is analyzing the power of media and public opinion. We have the triad loop, where power shapes media and media frames public opinion. And opinion, once it is framed in that pro-Zionist with license politics and policy, and then policy will generate these new facts in which they impose their dictates and their policies. And then we have in the crisis management advantage, when you have official briefings that dominate the early coverages in the media, because I'm speaking to media people now. So platforms would reward this massive audience and they shape the dominant discourse. So to break this loop, we need to create evidence and facts hubs. We need to have a disciplined message houses, people ready for this, to anticipate and be ready. And we need to dominate social media because they can't control social media. And we've seen during Tufan al-Aqsa how social media has become one of the friends of the Palestinian narrative because they cannot control it. Even though they try to influence it, they try to control it, but they're having difficulty, particularly with Instagram and TikToks. We need to create rapid response teams. These would be ready. These would be full-time people, well-educated, well-prepared to rapidly respond to this narrative, this false narrative of the Zionists and their supporters. And we need to have institutional footholds, particularly in the legal community, in the academic community, and in the media as well. And these are some of the strategic responses to build cross-movement alliances, educate about the Zionist tactics, which I talked about a little bit, legally challenge unconstitutional laws, support targets of repression, promote Palestinian-led narratives, and then we need to have a transformational movement. And by that, I mean that we need to have press freedom and global advocacy. And finally, we need to build coalitions. And as I said earlier, that deal with rapid response and media narratives to be ready. Public opinion is changing. We have seen this during Tufan al-Aqsa. There is a huge gap between the public sentiment and elite policy that will take time to propagate into policy, but that's going in the right direction. So in conclusion, we have the Zionist narrative lobbying. It's a system of control, not just influence. That's exactly what they're trying to do. We try to expose and counter it. This is a moral and strategic duty. And finally, we must act with courage, discipline, and with deep understanding of the challenges before us so that we can make a difference. Thank you so much.
Okay, wow, Professor, thank you so much for the lecture. That was a lot. There was a lot to digest in the best way. In the best way, hopefully in the best way. I think we'll be talking about your points long after this session. But hey, let's not keep it one way. I'm sure many of you have burning questions. So let's jump into our Q&A session. Who wants to go first? Everyone? Anyone who wants to?
Ada yang mau nanya nggak, teman-teman?
Everyone?
Oke, bentar teh.
Okay.
Tes.
Just raise your hands.
Oh, bentar.
Probably.
Tes. Ada yang mau nanya teman-teman?
On the chat room.
Langsung ke saya sih. Oke. Yang deket-deket aja, bukan nanya.
Okay. Is there anyone in the audience want to ask?
Cik.
This is your moment,
Yeah.
guys. This is your moment. Probably you guys are confused.
Tes. Teh. Tenap, ini ada yang mau bertanya ya?
Okay, go ahead.
Oke.
Oke, nanya aja. Tes.
Cek. Oh, udah nyampe.
Oke, kadang.
Thank you so much, Mr. Professor, for brief explanation. More easy to absorb your material because you make it in drawing, so that all we need is to elaborate what that you have out. My name is Fadlan. I'm a newly graduate MA student of Good Studies from Social Science University of Ankara. And Alhamdulillah, I also participated in the 7th October International Seminar Kuala Lumpur in Istanbul, and attending the following seminar in June. And actually, I have sort of questions, but unfortunately, you could not come here. But inshallah, we are always welcoming you in future time. My questions here is from the presentation that you have mapped out, and I'm also taking from the other lectures that you explained, that you one day you emphasize that we are in need of revolutionary theory, and then at the same time, the Gaza genocide is the unprecedented event. So even there is no, there are many analysis about what was the best resistance that Palestine could do, but there is no. There are many similar events, but there is no unprecedented event like Gaza. So my question is twofold. The first is about reflective one. Is there any revolutionary theory in our Muslim history, such as how Prophet Muhammad or Umar bin Khattab predict the liberation of Al-Aqsa, or how Salahuddin predicted the liberation of Al-Aqsa? Because as far as I read, the revolutionary history in our history is like gradual change. There is no revolutionary. The second is about futuristic question. That is how there is so far I didn't find any analysis that can predict the future of Al-Aqsa, because I amazed with the writing of Samuel Herbert in 1915 about entitled "The Future of Palestine," and in this writing is very delicate. How delicate the Britain predicted the future, in which the Britain can not only predict how to liberate or how to conquer Al-Aqsa, but also how Jerusalem in his word, how to conquer Al-Aqsa, Jerusalem, and about how Jerusalem will be after Britain conquered. So it's very futuristic. While until nowadays, I cannot find any a revolutionary theory introduced by
by an academicians? Thank you, Professor.
These are two very good questions. I have elaborate answers. I don't think I have the time to talk about the revolutionary theory in Islam. I would love to do that. Perhaps I could come again and talk about it. But in terms of the change in Islam, Islam does not have any particular way of making change. There are certain guidelines. But when it comes to the Zionist threat, I believe that the proper way of handling it, which comes to your second question, what will be the prediction of the future? I also have another lecture that I could give that will take at least 45 minutes, and I can talk about how Islam looks at this struggle and how it is tied to the future of the Islamic Renaissance, to the future of what I call the second universality of Islam. I believe that Islam started from the Medina state in the first year of Hijrah and stayed more or less intact for about 1300 years. The trend was going always rising, but of course it came to an abrupt halt towards the beginning of the 20th century with the fall of the Ottoman Empire. Now we are living in the state between the first universality of Islam and the second universality of Islam. It is this period that we are living in. And I believe that the second universality of Islam, when Islam as a body politic will rise only after we deal with the Zionist challenge. Without dealing with the Zionist challenge, we will still be dealing with challenges, but we'll never be able to deal with the issues of the time. And I believe that there is a Quranic reference from Surah Al-Isra that I can interpret. Again, I don't have the time today, perhaps in the future, in which I can prove that this is the case, that the first universality of Islam came with this confrontation that took place briefly in Medina. There was the rise of Islam, and then the second universality is going to come with this confrontation with the Zionist menace. That's what also makes the Zionist challenge a central issue for the not only for the reformation of the Islamic civilization and the rise of Islamic civilization and revival, but also for all Muslim states. I believe that Palestinians are not simply, Palestine does not become central because Palestinians are suffering the most. I believe many peoples have suffered. The Afghanis, the Iraqis, the Syrians, the Somalis, the Libyans, the Yemenis, many countries around the world, the Kurds, the Uyghurs, many people suffered. What makes Palestine central is not even tied to that it's a holy place and where it's the land of Al-Isra wal-Mi'raj and the holy prophets and so on and so forth. What makes Palestine unique is not even about Palestinians. It's about the nature of the enemy. And if I have to redefine it, I will not redefine it as the Palestinian cause. I think we are dealing with the Israeli phenomena, with the Israeli challenge, with the Israeli problem. This is how we should look at it. And unless we deal with this from the roots, we will not be able to progress as a Muslim Ummah. That is the central challenge. And that's why I said when we look at the sources of strength and the aims and objectives of the Israeli challenge, you will find that what Israelis are trying to do is to dominate and to be the hegemon in the region, at the heart of the Arab and Muslim world. And for them to do that, they want to make sure that this region, that these countries in the heart of the Islamic world stay weak, divided, fragmented, exhausted, unable to rise, unable to unite, unable to progress, unable to have any kind of advancement or civilization, because this is the only way they can rule. This is the only way they can control. This is the only way they can dominate. This is the only way they can become a hegemon. And that's why they're going to go and make sure that you have despots and tyrants in charge of these countries. They want to make sure that you have all these minorities. They're going to make sure that these minorities their fates are tied to them. They're trying to go and sow all kinds of discord and all kinds of problems with these minorities, Christians, Druze, Alawites, you name them, Kurds, any kind of problems, African versus Arab, Kurd versus Turk, and so on and so forth. They have a stake in making sure that they can break up our communities and our societies so that they can dominate. That's why this is so dangerous. And Palestinians on their own, they cannot solve this. You know, we're small people. We can't be able to stand up to this. All what we can do is to make sure that struggle continues and that we stay on our land, so that the others will also start waking up and deal with this struggle. So in short, when we talk about revolutionary theory, yes, there is a revolutionary theory. Yes, we can trace it back, because revolution means that you have uprooted the powers and those who are in control, and you bring the forces of good and the forces of justice and freedom into power, rather than those who are tyrants. Islam does have a theory about this, and it is tied also a lot to facts on the ground. You know, this is not something that you have simply from scripture. You have also to understand the historical experiences of the people. And also, not only we have a revolutionary theory, but we also have an Quranic grounding in how to deal with the current challenge of Israel. And therefore, just to sum up, we have an Israeli problem. They made it into a Palestinian problem, but we have an Israeli problem that was created by the West, that is pushed to us by the West, that they're trying to export their problem into our midst so that we can stay in this state of weakness, this state of fragmentation, and that we need to pick ourselves and try to deal with this issue, with this challenge, as being the most fundamental challenge that we are facing. And of course, it's going to depend where you are geographically. Certainly, people who are far away, like Indonesia, may not have to struggle as much as those people who are in the neighborhood, but it's the same threat, and it is the same challenge that everybody has to face. And there is a way to do this. And the way to do this is to understand and identify their sources of strength and their weak points, and try to deal with this in a situation where the final objective is to dismantle these structures that are trying to keep the status quo and keep the state of weakness, and change it to the point where Muslims can be independent again. They can become sovereign again, in order to start their own quest towards civilizational development, towards revival, towards renaissance. That's how this should be done. So in every country, you have to look at the foreign influence and Zionist influence and try to eradicate. So if you're in Indonesia, your main task, if you are an Islamic movement or a nationalist movement, is to identify foreign influence, Zionist influence, try to eradicate that influence. Once you do that, you achieve some sort of sovereignty and independence. Then you can do whatever you like. But you will find that all these things are tied together. The international institutions in which they can control people through loans and through economic and cultural and political and military means, it's the same everywhere. And therefore, we have to have a global struggle in order to get out of this situation. But I'll be happy to come again and discuss in details some of these ideas.
Thank you, Professor. And thank you for the question, Brother Fadlan. Am I right? Okay. Next question, probably from the audience, or
Oke,
we will
Teh.
to the chat room.
Apa gimana? Tenap, suaranya kecil. Cek. Teh Nabila, one more question
Okay.
from Farli. Okay.
Okay, please go ahead, Fadli.
Okay, thank you.
Sarah, Sister Sarah, there is no voice. Sarah.
Okay.
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 We
Thank you for your lecture tonight, and this has been an honor for me to hear straight from you and be in one forum with you. In case you don't know, for the past few days, there has been chaos in Indonesia in few cities in Indonesia. On the other hand, we as activists know that this should not stop us from spreading the message of Palestinian resistance. So my question is, what is the narration that we can bring at this time of chaos in Indonesia, which can represent our empathy both for Indonesia, our country, and to the Palestinians? Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. Your number one task should be right now not to allow normalization to take place between Indonesia and the Zionist state. You may find this very strange at this time of genocide. You might find this is beyond the means of Zionists to compel Indonesia to normalize with the Zionist state. But you have to keep in mind, before Tufan al-Aqsa, Indonesia was on its path towards normalization. It was being dragged by some Arab countries as well as international powers to normalize, because right now they think, the Zionists think, that they have been able to reach their zenith power. They have been able to get to the top. And the idea was going to be, if we bring Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and Indonesia, we have triumphed, because the whole Islamic world now by then would have normalized, even though there are some countries that they haven't done it officially. Indonesia is the largest Muslim country in the world. And as you see, Zionism is not an ideology that we can live with. It's an ideology that believes it has to be in charge and in control. It is willing to use whatever means available under its disposal, including genocide, war crimes, wars of extermination, ethnic cleansing, whatever it does, as you see, in order to achieve its goals. And therefore, the people of Indonesia, despite what their elites would say, despite the international pressure, despite what Arab regimes would come and tell them, should never normalize with such a state. Our goal should be to eradicate Zionist influence in Indonesia, to eradicate foreign influence that is supportive of Zionism in Indonesia. That should be our goal. That should be our question. That should be our marching orders. That should be our building a movement towards these goals. We should never buy into this false narrative that there is a political horizon of a two-state solution. There is no two-state solution. Your leaders, your political leaders may come and tell you there is now a path towards political reconciliation with the Palestinians, and that we need to be on board with this. We need to go and normalize and accept, because Indonesia needs international support. It needs international powers. It needs money. It needs this. It needs that. All that is an attempt to bribe the largest country in the world in order to normalize with it so that they can have legitimacy. And I believe that if we can maintain that red line, Indonesia will never be able to do, will never normalize until Palestinian rights are fully restored. That includes the right of return. Then it does not have legitimacy in the Muslim world. Same for Pakistan, same for Saudi Arabia, same for all other countries who have not allowed themselves to be caught into this false narrative. So if you ask me what you're supposed to do, you need to stand up to this attempt to drag Indonesia into a normalization deal with Israel. This is what they're trying to do, and also to eradicate Zionist influence and to support the Palestinian resistance and resilience as much as possible. Palestinians need to stay on their own land and never allow themselves to be expelled. They're trying to bring a few 100,000 to Indonesia. You should never accept that. You should support the Palestinians, but as a reward for the Zionist barbarity and Zionist violence and Zionist terrorism and Zionist genocide, that we allow either the United States or other powers to take the Palestinians out of Palestine so that they can be scattered around the world. That should never be allowed. Yes, you should support the Palestinians. You can get their injured, and you can allow them for medical aid and so on and so forth. You give them whatever aid you can, but you should never be the place we are going to absolve the Zionists from the crimes that they have been committing against the Palestinian people.
Any question, guys? Any other questions?
Any other
Okay.
question?
Ada Kak, dari Izudin. Suaranya kedengeran kan ya? Kabi kok Kabi sih. Kak Tenap, maaf. Konsentrasi
What
aku
about
sudah
my
mulai
voice?
menurun.
What about my voice? Can you guys hear my voice loud and clear?
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Alhamdulillah. Thanks for the lecture, Professor. My name is Muhammad Izzuddin, and I want to ask about what is your view about the opinion expressed by educational researcher Dr. Majid Irsan Al-Kilani from Jordan. Said that the first step toward the creation of Al-Aqsa or Palestine is to begin with self-criticism of the internal weakness of the Ummah, and to comprehensive educational reform. Thanks for the response.
I'm sorry, the voice was breaking up. I did not hear the question in full. Can you repeat it, please?
Sarah, Sister Sarah, will you help us? The voice is actually breaking. Sarah, Sister Sarah.
Oh.
Professor cannot hear the question. Would you guys repeat the question?
Okay. Suaranya masuk nggak ya, Teh?
Okay, now, yeah, we can hear you now. It's good.
My question is, my name is Muhammad Izzuddin. Thanks for the lecture, Professor. My question is, what is your view about the opinion from educational researcher from Jordan? His name is Dr. Majid Irsan Al-Kilani, who wrote a book, Hakad al-Harajil Salahuddin, about a step to liberation Palestine and Al-Aqsa, began from self-criticism about the weakness of Ummah, and we must do a comprehensive educational reform.
Thank you very much for the question. The question is about a book by Majid Irsan Al-Kilani, about his book concerning the generation of Salahuddin. I believe history is a good learning experience, that people should know their history, should learn from the history, should use the history in terms of learning many lessons. But I believe that every generation and every challenge is unique. Not all challenges are the same. And therefore, I believe we should read such narratives and read such books in order to understand what happened in the past. But this is not a repetition of the same challenge. The Zionist challenge is not dissimilar, but it's also unique to the Crusaders. And I believe that once we understand the nature of the Zionist challenge, and once we understand the true principles and teachings of Islam, of the Quran, of our culture, of the modern world, of geopolitics, of the sunan, the laws that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put in this life, then we need to combine all these together in addition to the historical experiences in order to be able to give a proper response. I tried to do briefly in this lecture, but I can also elaborate in the future what I think our quest for meeting this challenge must be. I believe that we need to understand the nature of this challenge, and we should also give a proper ultimate civilizational model and civilizational solution. Our ultimate solution is to dismantle, this is very important, to dismantle the Zionist structures that are trying to keep this region and this ummah in a state of weakness, in a state of being under control and domination and hegemony. And to do that, we have to understand the nature of that challenge and its sources of strength. I believe eventually there will be a question asked, and what are we going to do about the Jews? If we dismantle the structures in Palestine today, because talking about military victory, and that's what many of these writings are talking about. That's what people would like to talk about, that there will be eventually meeting of two armies ending with one defeating the other. And I say that is not necessarily the end of the conflict. That might be, but it's not necessarily the only conflict, the only result or the only outcome of a conflict. It's not necessarily two armies facing each other when one is going to vanquish the other. What we are saying here is that this is a unique challenge. It has its own sources, and that this is not about two armies where one army is going to meet with the other. This is what they think is going to happen. But my contention is that there are other forms of resistance. There are other forms of weakening this imperative. We summarize them in 12, but there are many, 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 many aspects to these 12 imperatives that we need to work on that. Meanwhile, when the state institutions, when the structures collapse, when the imperatives of strength are weakened and they can no longer be operative, people will say, what are we going to do about the Jews that stay there? And our civilizational solution to this is that let's go and find out what the roots of this. The roots of this is that Europe, because of its racism and discrimination and persecution of its Jewish communities, it wanted to export its excess of Jews, implant them in this part of the world. If they don't want to take them back, or if the Jews refuse to go back because of that racism, they are welcome to stay in the Muslim world, from Tanja in Morocco to Jakarta in Indonesia, as immigrants, as people who are being persecuted, and they want safety, place to stay, because our religion, our culture calls for this. But they cannot come as invaders. They cannot come demanding sovereignty and demanding that they can establish their own entities at the expense of the indigenous people. This is unacceptable. This happened in the past when the Crusaders and during the Spanish Inquisition, they expelled both Jews and Muslims from Andalusia. Many of them came and immigrated to the Muslim world, again in Morocco, in North Africa, even in Turkey and Istanbul, as well as beyond. This is a humanitarian gesture that the Muslims are willing to do. But if they don't want to go back to Europe or the United States or other places, they are welcome to stay here, but not as a sovereign country in Palestine, by demanding that they have to have their own state at the expense of the rights and justice for Palestinians.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor, for the explanation. Is there any other question, Sister Sarah?
Okay. There are two questions.
Okay.
Good evening, Professor. My name is Vila. I want to ask, and maybe my question is very simple. Hello, check.
Sorry,
Yes.
Sarah, Sister Sarah, we cannot hear the question, Sarah.
Okay, wait. Tes.
Okay.
Tes tes.
Yeah, we can hear you. We can hear you.
Oke.
Okay.
Okay. Bismillah. Good evening, Professor. My name is Tila, and I want to ask, and maybe my question is very simple. I still don't know why Israel chose Palestine line to place as a place they can control, or why Zionists want people of Palestine gone, and what is the basic reason why Zionists choose Palestine? Yeah, that is my question. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I did not hear it very well. Maybe somebody can say it because the voice is not very clear.
Sarah, Sister Sarah, would you please repeat the question? Because we did not hear well.
Maju aja.
Udah cek halo, udah masuk teh suaranya?
Yeah, we can. Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, I want to ask to Professor, and maybe my question is very simple question. Why Zionists choose Palestine land to to place as a place they can control? Why not other country? Why Palestine? That is my question. Thank you.
Very well. We have to go back to the beginning of the Zionist movement. The Zionist movement was the current political Zionist movement was organized by Theodor Herzl. Theodor Herzl was a Hungarian Austrian Jew who was not very religious. He was actually atheist, secular, but he felt that the Jews are being discriminated against in Europe. He was a journalist, and he, after experiencing or seeing that there is quite racism in Europe, particularly in France, through a trial that he was covering by a French officer by the name of Alfred Dreyfus, he decided to write the book, The Jewish State, and also start organizing different Jews in Europe. He started with Jews in Europe, but then expanded in order to establish a Jewish homeland. This was the dominant narrative, that people who are suffering must have their own state to do their own self-determination. He did not care where that country is. There were many proposals, Uganda, Argentina, Malta, and others were proposed as being possible destinations of this national home. But he couldn't get a consensus, particularly from religious Jews. They were not enthusiastic about establishing a Jewish homeland, except into what they considered the land of the Torah, the biblical land of Palestine. That got a lot of them excited. He really didn't care which one. All what he wanted was a land for the Jews, so that they can free themselves from the persecution and from the racism of Europe. But since there was more consensus, particularly among Eastern European Jews of Palestine, they chose that in one of their congresses, that Palestine would be that destination. And therefore, they were trying to encourage as many Jews to go and settle in Palestine. But Palestine, of course, was inhabited. Palestine was not free to be taken by anybody. It was under the Ottoman control by that time for almost 400 years. And he was not able to convince either the Sultan Abdul Hamid at the time, or the people to allow this to happen. And of course, that's when they allowed. He, by the way, he died in 1904, very frustrated and thinking that his project has totally failed. But the project was picked up, the mantle was picked up by Weizmann and Ben Gurion and other Zionist leaders, in which they started going and appealing to international powers to convince them that the goals of Zionism, of establishing a Zionist state in Palestine, and those goals of the imperialist and colonial powers are aligned. They appeal to Britain that they can serve the empire by the fact that they can be in Palestine, control Palestine, that the biggest prize or the biggest possession of the British at the time was India, which they colonized in the 19th century. And that's the only way you can control this is by controlling the Suez Canal. And since the Suez Canal was under threat, having the Israelis or the state, the Zionist state, on the eastern bank of Suez, or at least close by, will prevent any power to come actually and threaten the Suez Canal and therefore threaten the biggest possession of the British. The British were convinced by the turn of the 20th century that giving Palestine to the Zionists to have a Jewish homeland will serve British colonial interests. The same thing happened after 1967. After the 1967 war, the American strategists, particularly in the defense establishment in the Pentagon, they were convinced that Israel could be considered as a strategic asset, was able to take over the most important part of the Middle East within few days of 1967 militarily, that it can be relied on to serve American interest, national interest in the region, and therefore with a very vibrant Zionist influence and Zionist lobbying efforts and Zionist structures in America, they were able to convince many of the elites, political, military, and otherwise, of Americans to come and buy into this notion that the Israeli narrative or the Israeli national security imperatives and the Americans are aligned, and therefore they can rely on the Israelis to keep or to safeguard the national security interests of the US in the region. Of course, there's a lot there to be argued, that this is a false narrative, that this is not necessarily the case, but that's how it became to be. They allied themselves with international powers after they decided that in order to bring most of the Jews, not necessarily all the Jews, into this project, they had to choose the land of Palestine and then ally themselves with international powers to keep that link and to keep that power in order to keep Palestine.
Okay, Alhamdulillah. Well, I mean, Sister Sarah, thank you, Professor, for the explanation. Sarah, is there any more question, or probably we should close the Q&A session?
Last
There one
question,
more?
Teh.
Okay, last question. Okay.
Yes, last question. Okay.
Okay, thanks for the opportunity. My name is Sula. I'm from political science student in Pajajaran University. I once joined an Indonesian youth conference for Gaza, where one of the speakers, the Canadian ambassador, expressed support for the two-state solution. I personally oppose it, since I believe it's not a real solution. And I also raised the failure of the Oslo. However, the ambassador responded by saying that even the two-state solution is too good to be true. If ever achieved, would be a kind of utopia, because one-state solution is impossible, as Israel will reject it. So, how do you, Professor, view this perspective? Thank you.
Well, a two-state solution, as I alluded to in my presentation, is an illusion. It is not a true solution. It could have been, at one point, a compromise when the Palestinians made their concession, where the Israeli settlements were at the fringes of the West Bank. But even with the two-state solution, there will always be a problem, because the Israelis will never be convinced that the Palestinians have given up their rights in the rest of Palestine. So they will always try to fragment the neighbors, they're trying to weaken them, because this is how they feel safe, because they know they stole the land, and a thief always wants to make sure that the victim will not be empowered one point to go back and get back their lands. So despite that, there were few Palestinian leaders willing to concede much of Palestine, they know in their hearts that the Palestinians, particularly those who are from the 1948 areas, will never give up their rights. And therefore, they believe that they cannot give in to any Palestinian demand, because that would be a stepping stone towards more demands. And that's what the Israeli policy has been. So this notion by some diplomats, some political leaders, some governments, to deceive their people and tell them that there is somehow a political solution on the horizon, that there is a two-state solution, is just an illusion. It is just one way to absolve themselves from the responsibility of facing up to this challenge, of standing up to this challenge, which is called the Zionist movement. The Zionist movement, the Zionist state, the Zionist entity, and Zionists around the world want Israel to be as strong as possible and to dictate to the region as much as possible. And for that to happen, all others have to be weakened, have to be under control, have to be not representative of their peoples, because their peoples know that this is not justice. If we had democratic governance throughout the region, most of the people would not approve of the presence and existence of a Zionist state that stole the land from its rightful people, indigenous people, and then wants to dictate to the whole region to stay in a state of weakness and fragmentation and division, because they know this is not how they want to live, or they want the future generations to live. Now, this is all just a philosophical presentation, but if you go to realities today, when people talk about a two-state solution, what are they talking about? Palestinians have zero cards to play. The Palestinians have given up under international pressure, under Islamic pressure, under Arab pressure, to all the cards that they have. They have nothing else left to give. They have given up the legitimacy question by recognizing Israel on 78%, and Israel has refused to give them anything back. What the Israelis want is for the Palestinians to disappear, and they're trying to do their best for that to happen. When they say two-state solution, how are they going to uproot 800,000 and soon to be, they think, 1 million settlers from the West Bank? They cannot even bring one bottle of water to a thirsty child in Gaza. Are you telling me that the Muslim governments who met twice, once on 11th November 2023 and a second time on 11 November a year later 2024, and they agreed only on one thing, which is to provide Palestinians in Gaza with aid, with massive aid, and they could not bring one bottle of water to a thirsty child without Netanyahu saying so, that somehow this power, including the Europeans and others, will force the Israelis to give up the West Bank and Gaza? Is that realistic? And if it's not realistic, what's the alternative? The only alternative which governments don't want to face, because that means they have to take strong stance in front of their people. That means they have to stand up to this Zionist menace, to this Zionist challenge, to this Zionist brutality, to the Zionist genocide. They have to take a stand by cutting off relations, by making the policy towards Israel as a policy of dismantling these Zionist, racist, supremacist structures. They don't want to do that because there is a cost to be paid. Everybody is trying to cozy up to Trump and to the United States. And if they're going to take a strong stand against Zionism, against the Zionist entity and the Zionist state, that means they have to face up to the Americans, and they have to treat this as a price to pay. And they don't want to have to pay any prices. So they deceive their people by telling them that somehow there is a political solution on the horizon, knowing fully well that there is no political solution. That's what's happening today, is taking more and more of the Palestinian land and expelling more and more of the Palestinian people in order to realize greater Israel. The sooner we come to this conclusion that the only solution is to dismantle the Zionist structures, this is the only solution for all Muslim countries and beyond to adopt, that means people have to start making decisions and policies different from what they are seeing. So don't believe this diplomat or this political leader. All what they're doing, they're trying to absolve themselves of the responsibility to take strong stands that will come with it certain prices to pay, because the United States is the hegemon in the world and is trying to make people pay. And these politicians and these diplomats don't want to pay that price. So they delude us, they deceive us with this notion that there is somehow a two-state solution when there, in fact, there is not.
Okay, Alhamdulillahirrahmanirrahim. Sister Sarah, are we done? The question is done? Okay, Professor. Thank you. Okay. Okay, Professor, thank you so much for the explanation. Thank you so much for the lecture. But before we go, I just have to say this. I just have to say this because I don't know I'll ever get another chance to speak directly to you. So I'm a fan, like a huge one. It's such an honor to share this stage with you. It's like I'm flying over the moon. I've read and listened to some of your story, especially what happened to you in the state after 9/11, how much you had to go through, and yet here you are with us, and here you are with us, still speaking out, still standing tall. That's incredibly inspiring. So on behalf of all of us, thank you so much. Jazakallah khairan kasiran, not only for tonight's lecture, but for your lifelong service and courage, I guess. The Ummah is truly blessed to have you. We
Thank
deeply
you.
admire you, and we pray Allah keeps you strong and blesses your journey ahead. But before we let you go, sir, can I ask one last request, one last question? Could you share a final advice for us, especially for us young people, on how to stay strong in supporting this cause? Because honestly, Professor, things are not easy here in Indonesia, in Jakarta, in whole Indonesia. Nothing compared to Palestine, of course, but we're also facing a difficult moment right now. There's an ongoing protest, a deadly demonstration, actually, against an evil government right now happening in Indonesia. So maybe you can give us some words to strengthen our hearts and remind us to keep fighting for justice for Palestine. Would you like to share some, Professor?
Sure. Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for your kind words and for your prayers. And I want to tell people, if you feel somehow down, or you feel that the world is not going according to what you would like to see, that this is a struggle, and the world is a struggle. And if you go back and read the stories of the prophets, the stories of the Prophet Muhammad particularly, the whole time throughout 23 years in Mecca and Medina was a life of struggle. And all what we do is to try to learn from his example. And from that example, we could see all kinds of challenges that he had to meet. But always the faith never wavered, never waned, was always on the rise. It was always knowing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will reward faithful people. We just have to abide by the rules. We know also now that the example of Gaza, nothing is happening, whatever is happening in Indonesia, and I'm not aware exactly what's happening, but whatever is happening in Indonesia, nothing compares to what's happening in Gaza. You have a whole population that are being bombarded day in and day out for almost 2 years. Everybody has lost their residence. They didn't just lose some job or some money or possessions, their residences. Many of them lost their children. Some of them lost their parents and their grandparents and their aunts and sisters. Whole families have been destroyed. On top of that, you have people who are in the streets, homeless, without shelter, and sometimes injured, and they are even unable to feed their children, even unable to feed themselves. They have to face starvation and famine. They have to face bombing and sniping, and they have to provide for their children, and they can't. They have to fight for their shelter, and they can't. And despite all these challenges, and despite whatever has been done to them, they still have faith. They still pray. They still talk to God. They did not lose their faith. Actually, their faith is there because they know at the end that their fate is in the hands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is all part of the challenges and part of the sacrifices they have to make in order for this ummah to wake up again. So whatever you're facing in Indonesia, nothing, it pales in comparison to what's happening today in Gaza. So I hope that gives the inspiration needed for people to rise up and know that what is happening today in Palestine is a warning shot to all the people across the world, certainly in the Islamic world, is that if we don't confront this challenge, if we do not face up and stand up to these Zionist policies and Zionist behavior, that this could be the punishment that could come to all of us. And therefore, we have no choice, we have no recourse except to accept this challenge and rise up to it and do what's it's necessary to do it, but do it in the same spirit, the spirit of faith and the spirit of giving and the spirit of sacrifice and the spirit of accepting whatever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala destines for us. This is the principal teaching that we know from reading the life of the Prophet and from understanding the teachings of the Quran.
MashaAllah. Thank you so much, Professor, for those powerful words. We'll hold them close and carry them forward, inshallah. And with that, we officially close the lecture tonight on behalf of everyone. Once again, our deepest gratitude to you, Professor Sami Arian. May Allah protect you, bless your family, and continue to strengthen you in this struggle. Probably we're gonna take picture, right? Sister Sarah?
Yeah,
We're gonna take
come
picture
on.
with Professor Sami,
Smile, please. Okay.
Okay.
Lihat ke kamera di sebelah kiri. Say hello to Prof. Sami. Hello, Prof. Sami. Assalamualaikum.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. Thank you very much.
Okay. So, okay, ready, guys?
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Sami.
Aman.
Jazakallah khairan katsiran. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, Professor. And to all the participants, thank you for being here with me. Let's keep the spirit alive beyond this room. Thank you so much, Sarah, for inviting me to this tonight. It's a really, really biggest disappointment for me to not being there with you. But thank you so much. Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you so much for everyone. Bye. Bayaki.
Untuk Nabila. Bye.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Oke. Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Oke, alhamdulillah teman-teman, sesi dengan Prof. Sami sudah selesai. Semoga di akhir tahun kita bisa ketemu langsung sama beliau ya. Amin, amin. Nah, teman-teman, setelah ini aku serahkan mic ini kepada divisi acara dan Kang Rofit, kepada Tahira dan Rofit dipersilahkan. Tawarin dulu ya.
Oke, maaf ya teman-teman. Akan mengambil sedikit waktu istirahat. Nggak tahu sedikit, nggak tahu banyak.